He was bullied every day until he awakened his SS rank skill. The story begins with a merchant driving through a forest all by himself. Far away, some goblins spotted him and thought he'd be an easy target. They jumped at him, scaring the merchant a lot. He screamed for help, hoping someone would hear him. Luckily, some warriors were nearby, and they came to the rescue. They killed the first goblin that had jumped onto the merchant's wagon and told him to keep going while they took care of the other goblin. The team of warriors managed to defeat all the goblins in the forest that day, and then went back to the city. Then, we met our main character named Fate, who was feeling hungry because his stomach was growling. The group of warriors returned victoriously, and Fate overheard them talking about their success. Fate felt like he could never go goblin hunting like them because he believed he was completely useless. He blamed his misfortune on a skill he called Gluttony because his stomach never stopped growling. However, Fate reminded himself to be thankful because at least he had a job. Some time later, everyone in town was amazed as the Holy Knights came through. They were a trio of siblings known as the Valeric siblings. A man accidentally dropped some food that touched one of the knights, and this made him very scared. The knight named Hado questioned what the man was doing, and the man tried to explain but got furious because the knight was talking to him. The man started apologizing, but this only made the knights even angrier. They warned that anyone who disrespects them will have their heads cut off. Eventually, they left, and the man was lucky to still be alive. People were upset, but no one dared to do anything about it. In the castle, Fate was happy that the day was almost over, and he looked forward to going home. The knights arrived at the castle and asked Fate if he thought he did a good job while they were away. Fate believed he did well, but one of the knights, Raphael, tossed his pay on the ground. To make matters worse, he made Fate pick it up in front of them. Hado deliberately stepped on Fate's hand and mockingly apologized, saying Fate was so dirty that he didn't notice him. Fate's tummy starts making noise at a really bad time, and Raphael points out how gross Fate is. The knights get super angry because Fate's tummy sounds like he doesn't get paid enough, and they start beating him up really badly. Fate thinks about how in this world, there are people who have special powers given by gods, and then there are those who don't. The knights treat him like a punching bag and say he only has a job because of them. They tell him he should be thankful, and when he slacks off, it makes them look bad. They make him stand up just to knock him down again and say he needs to learn a lesson. They talk about disciplining defiant dogs. But then, someone named Roxy tells them to stop. She says it's not right for holy knights to hurt the people they're supposed to protect. Roxy takes over Fate's care and tells him that they are in the same boat when it comes to guarding the gate. She says that's how a real holy knight should act. She starts guarding the gate, and Fate, instead of thanking her like a normal person, says he's used to it and leaves. He's worried about what Raphael might do to him. Fate isn't a complete loser, he's just trying to protect Roxy and doesn't want her to get involved. The bartender warns Fate that if he lets the knights treat him like that, he'll end up like the last guy, and it won't be good. On his way home, Fate's mad because his stomach is still growling even though he just ate a big meal. He's upset about his gluttony skill, and wishes he had a better one. He'd be okay with being a warrior, merchant, or craftsman. Suddenly, Fate sees some thieves attacking someone, and his first thought is to get Roxy. He tells her about it, and she leaves him in charge of guarding the gate. Fate just stands there while he hears Roxy beating up the thieves. Then, one of the thieves comes running towards Fate, and he's scared at first. But he stops himself and decides to fight back. He manages to defeat the thief, and then something strange happens. His gluttony skill activates, and he gets new skills called Identify and Telepathy. Fate is really confused because he can hear Roxy's thoughts. But then, it stops, and he can't hear her anymore. He tells her he's okay, and she wants to give him credit for defeating the thief. But instead, she offers him a job with her family as a way of saying thanks. At first, Fate wants to say no, but she insists. She asks him if he wants to work for the Valeric family until it kills him. Fate thinks about it and realizes he has two choices, one where he keeps getting treated badly, and the other where he works for Roxy's family. He decides to go with the second option and agrees to work for her family. Fate is sitting in his bedroom when he suddenly realizes that all his ability, like his strength and skills, are now much stronger, way beyond what he's used to. He's also got some new ability, and he thinks one of them might be telepathy, which is the ability to read minds. He's not sure what's happening to his body, but he's feeling more confident because he might be able to fight monsters with these new powers. The next day, Fate goes looking for a sword, but the merchant tells him he's too poor to buy one. Fate's been in the royal capital for 5 years, and all he's saved up is 2 silver coins from working hard. But the merchant tells him he can still afford some really bad weapons that he keeps in a barrel. While checking the barrel, Fate uses his new skill, Identify, to see the stats of the weapons. They all have 0 for durability and strength, but there's one dirty, trashy-looking sword that catches his eye. It's as if the sword and he have something in common. Suddenly, Fate hears a voice coming from the sword. The sword's name is Greed, and it tells Fate to hurry up and buy it because it's worth it. Greed mentions that it knows about Fate's gluttony, and they have something in common. Fate leaves his 2 coins and happily takes his new talking sword with him. Meanwhile, the Valak family discusses how Roxy is trying to hire Fate for the Hart household without asking them. Memo suggests teaching Roxy a lesson, but Raphael thinks Fate can be easily replaced. He also points out that the Harts and the Valeric family are both part of the 5 great families that support the kingdom, so they shouldn't complicate things. Raphael goes to the military district, surprising Memo. She asks what he plans to study this time, and he shocks her by saying he wants to study how to become immortal. Sometime later, Fate is walking with his talking sword when it warns him that something is approaching. A goblin suddenly appears, but Fate can easily destroy it now. Each time he defeats a goblin, his gluttony skill activates, making him even stronger. Greed finds this amusing. However, Fate gets into big trouble when hundreds of goblins appear. Surprisingly, Fate becomes a completely different person as he slices through several of them. After each goblin is defeated, his gluttony skill activates repeatedly. Fate manages to defeat all the goblins and is shocked to see that his stats have increased to an incredible level. Greed suggests that Fate must be full now. Fate notices that his stomach hasn't growled at all that day, which is unusual for him. Fate is confused because he thought people were born with the skills they would always have. Greed explains that's true, but Fate's gluttony skill is different. Normally, stats increase with experience in battles, and your level goes up. But Fate's gluttony skill steals stats and other skills instead of benefiting from experience. This is why Fate is still at level 1 despite his incredible ability. Greed surprises Fate by revealing that they are similar. They share something in common. Just then, they notice a group of warriors approaching. Greed warns Fate that his gluttony skill is not something he should let others discover. It's a skill that goes against divine rules. Fate decides that he should handle the fighting alone. But Greed reminds him that he's not alone anymore. Fate is happy that Greed has accepted him as his master, but Greed tells him to calm down and stop talking about being a master. Before they leave, Greed reminds Fate to collect the goblin ears so he can get paid. Afterward, Fate gets his reward and starts thinking about all the food he wants to buy. But Greed reminds him that they need to take care of the sword's maintenance first. Greed wants to be treated with the respect he thinks he deserves, but Fate thinks Greed is being a bit too demanding. Greed explains that his name is Greed for a reason. As they continue on their way, they encounter a man with a little girl who asks for help. Fate uses his identify skill to check the man's threat level, but he discovers that the man has a skill that hides his stats from Fate's ability. This means they can't be sure what this guy is capable of. Greed wonders what Fate will do, and Fate shows that he's a completely different person now. He says they can't ignore the girl's cry for help. They decide to follow the man, who reveals his cruel plan to make the girl a slave to the Holy Knights. Greed points out that the man is quite tough, and he warns Fate that this is his last chance to turn back. The story continues, and a sister explains that Lord Laplace created the world. When he disappeared, he gave everyone a special ability called a skill. People are thankful to Lord Laplace for this gift. At an orphanage, kids are eating their food, but one child isn't eating, and the sister is concerned he might be sick. The boy complains that Lord Laplace isn't fair because he gave amazing skills to holy knights and warriors, but gave him a weak skill. The sister recalls a time when Lord Laplace protected the world, and there were no skills, status, or monsters, and everyone lived equally. The boy wishes he was born during that time, and the sister comforts him. Another sister arrives and says they've searched for someone named Sahara in the area, but couldn't find her. They wonder where Sahara has gone. The scene shifts to a kidnapped girl being scolded by her kidnapper. He tells her to cry and shout more because it will please a holy knight when she becomes his plaything. The kidnapper is worried that this won't end well and leaves the girl, who begins crying. Fate arrives and assures her that she will be okay. He frees her from restraints and suggests they escape while the kidnapper is away. The kidnapper notices them and questions if Fate can fight while protecting the girl. Fate thinks he needs to keep the girl safe. Greed tells Fate to retreat further back, knowing that the kidnapper underestimates Fate's strength. Fate hides behind some boxes, and the kidnapper believes that people like Fate, who have a sense of justice, are useful. He plans to kill them in front of the kids to make them listen to him. Suddenly, Fate startles the kidnapper by throwing some boxes at him and launches an attack, but the kidnapper manages to dodge it. The kidnapper then says he's going to finish things and tries to use an attack called Sharp Edge. Greed figures out this attack and tells Fate to quickly cut the kidnapper using the sword. Fate does just that. After subduing the kidnapper, Fate asks who ordered him to kidnap the child. but the kidnapper initially refuses to say anything. Fate decides to use some pressure tactics and tortures the kidnapper a bit. Eventually, the kidnapper gives in and reveals that Hadoflar was the one behind the kidnapping. Fate takes the girl outside and realizes she's hungry. He suggests they get something to eat. The girl, whose name is Sahara, agrees. Fate buys some meat for both Sahara and himself. Sahara finds it delicious and mentions it's her first time having meat. This makes her emotional, and she starts crying. Moved by her tears, Fate shares some of his food with her. The scene shifts to Fate returning Sahara to the orphanage. Everyone is relieved to see her back, and Sahara and the sister express their gratitude to Fate. Fate mentions that it's the first time someone has thanked him because he has a weak skill. Sahara wonders if Fate's skill is also useless, and Fate admits that it always makes him hungry. Fate then offers some advice to Sahara. He tells her that no matter how tough life gets, she should try to laugh off the difficulties. He assures her that someday she'll find happiness. Fate remembers that his father once told him the same words. Back then, he didn't fully understand their meaning, but he realizes now that those words have helped him survive for so long. After their conversation, Fate leaves and realizes that he has gained a new skill called one-handed sword mastery from the kidnapper. Greed explains that with this skill, Fate can use technique skills, and it includes some arts that allow for a counterattack with 2 strikes. Fate thinks it must be similar to the sharp edge attack. Fate wonders what would have happened if the kidnapper had used sharp edge earlier. Greed mentions that Fate would likely have been killed if that had happened. Fate expresses frustration, feeling that Greed should have warned him about this earlier. Greed reminds Fate that battles also involve luck, and the strongest don't always win. Fate believes that luck would have been on his side today, but he doesn't want to rely on luck. Greed then reminds Fate that tomorrow is his first day of work at the House of Heart and questions if Fate plans to go there dressed as he is. Fate realizes he forgot to buy some clothes. The scene shifts to a man informing the restaurant's master that Lord Mason has been killed by the divine dragon. He's certain of it, as he confirmed with his warrior friend. He mentions that Roxy will now be the head of House Heart. Without Lord Mason, who prevented the tyranny of the Holy Knights, even Lady Roxy might struggle to keep them in check. The master is concerned about this development. The man wonders if Fate is okay, and the master mentions that Fate used to visit around this time after work, but he hasn't seen him today. The scene then cuts to Fate heading to House Heart. The next day, Fate dresses nicely and arrives at a large place. He meets Roxy there and is captivated by her beauty. He tells her she's so beautiful that he can't stop staring, making Roxy feel embarrassed. Roxy compliments Fate, saying he looks good too. She then takes him to a grave and explains it's her father's grave. Her father fought a dangerous creature called the divine dragon Galia 5 days ago and lost his life. Galia is a continent infested with monsters, and keeping them in check is the Holy Knight's duty. This year, it was House Heart's duty, and it's usually not very dangerous, but the divine dragon unexpectedly attacked and wiped out her father's entire team. Fate is surprised that Roxy is caring for him despite her difficult circumstances. Roxy asks him not to make such a sad face, and reveals that she's now the head of House Heart. She suggests they make things lively together, and Fate feels honored but hesitates to shake her hand because he can read thoughts when he touches someone. The head maid, Haru, arrives and introduces Fate to her. She asks Fate to behave appropriately as a servant from now on, and he agrees. The scene shifts to Fate happily eating meat at lunch, which surprises the other servants. Later, while working in the garden, Fate is told to take a break, but he wants to finish his work first. His co-workers, Oliver and Menura, mentioned that they initially thought he was strange because he talked to his sword. Fate's stomach growls, and Oliver realizes lunchtime is over, wondering if Fate didn't eat properly. Fate insists he's fine. Haru arrives and tells Fate that Lady Roxy wants to see him. Fate has tea with Roxy, but he's preoccupied with his growing hunger and doesn't respond to her question. Roxy brings him back to reality and calls him Faye. Fate is puzzled by this nickname and explains his late father used to call him that. His father was killed in a monster subjugation. Roxy insists that Faye is Fate's new nickname and says they're like a family now. Fate asks her to call him Fate instead, but Roxy refuses, and suddenly, Fate faints. He wakes up in his room and finds a letter telling him to take a day off and rest. Fate asks Greed what's wrong with him, and Greed explains that his hunger wasn't this intense before. Greed mentions that the gluttony skill can't be controlled once it craves a soul. The more souls Fate consumes, the stronger he'll become, but his appetite will grow too. Fate wonders what will happen if he stops consuming souls, and Greed warns that he might starve to death or lose control and attack others. Greed mentions that it shows in Fate's eyes when he loses control, and Fate notices that his eyes are now red. The scene changes to Fate going out to hunt some monsters. He notices that everyone around him smells delicious to him. Greed explains that it's because of his skill, Starvation Boost, which makes his Gluttony skill consume souls more efficiently. It also enhances his night vision and allows him to paralyze anyone with lower stats than him. Fate realizes that all the goblins around him are paralyzed, and he easily defeats them. However, it doesn't satisfy his hunger. Greed takes Fate to a nest of hobgoblins. There, Fate fights and defeats some hobgoblins using Greed's power. After killing several of them, Fate manages to calm down. He decides he doesn't want to experience this hunger again, and Greed warns that Fate will need to consume souls regularly if this continues. Fate agrees. Suddenly, the ground trembles, and Fate notices a Goblin King causing the tremors. The Goblin King's stats are similar to Fate's, and it has a skill called Auto Recovery. Fate wants that skill. The Goblin King eats a human it recently captured, and Fate launches a surprise attack, slicing off its arm. He dodges the Goblin King's subsequent attacks and defeats it. This increases Fate's stats, and he also gains the Auto Recovery skill. Greed mentions that Fate can now release his first stage, which is his new form. To unlock new forms, Fate needs to sacrifice some of his stat points to Greed. Fate wonders how many stat points he'll need to offer. Greed explains that Fate must give up all the points he's accumulated since they met. Fate hesitates, thinking it's too much, but Greed emphasizes that Fate will lose the qualifications to use him if he doesn't. He convinces Fate that they will become stronger together, and Fate agrees. Greed then transforms into his new form after absorbing Fate's stat points, and Fate notices that Greed's new form is a bow. Greed asks Fate to use the bow to kill the hobgoblin that has been spying on them. Fate wonders where the arrows are, and Greed explains that they will appear when Fate draws the string. Fate shoots the hobgoblin, and Greed tells him that he doesn't need to aim because the arrow will always hit its target. The arrow kills the hobgoblin. The scene shifts to Fate leaving the Goblin King's ears outside the orphanage. He thinks that with this, the children there will be able to eat without any problems for a while. The story continues as Roxy plans to sneak out of the house without anyone noticing. However, Fate catches her in the act. Roxy tells Fate not to surprise her like that, and he apologizes. He didn't recognize her because she looked different. He wonders if she's going to the fort dressed that way. Roxy explains that she had no choice but to go out since Fate already noticed her. She whispers to Fate that she's about to do a secret inspection in town and asks him to keep it a secret from the others. She's worried that Haru will be angry if she finds out. Fate understands and tries to go back to work, but Roxy asks him to accompany her on the inspection. The scene then shifts to Fate and Roxy in town. Fate reminds Roxy not to use her real name, as it would blow her cover. Roxy agrees and asks him to call her Lexi for the day. Greedy comments that it doesn't make a difference, but Fate tells him to be quiet. Roxy thinks Fate said that to her, and apologizes for being noisy. Fate clarifies that he wasn't talking to her, and says she's not noisy at all, which makes Roxy happy. She admits she got a little excited because she was with Fate, and they both get embarrassed. Greedy remarks that it must be nice to be young. Fate tries to throw Greedy, but Roxy intervenes, saying she won't allow Fate to be rough with his sword. She mentions that this is the first time she's seen Fate's sword, which makes Fate worry that it might seem suspicious, as people with non-combat skills usually don't carry swords. Fate realizes he can't let Roxy know about his Gluttony skill. He accidentally drops his sword, but Roxy catches it. She suggests that he should do some maintenance on the sword and mentions taking Fate to the Heart Smithy later. Fate thanks Roxy, and thinks that Greed must be happy because they might finally get to do some maintenance on him. Roxy and Fate hurry to the main market in town. Roxy notices some fine grapes at a shop. The shopkeeper says these grapes were picked from Heart's territory that morning. Roxy wants to taste them, and the shopkeeper gives her a few to try. Fate tastes them too and finds them really good. Roxy mentions that the grapes came from her house. The shopkeeper is confused, and Greed suggests that Fate tell the shopkeeper that Roxy's relatives work in Heart's territory. Fate does so, and Roxy thanks him for the quick save. Someone then alerts them that the Holy Knights are coming, and everyone in the market clears a path for them. People think that since Lord Mason's passing, even the lowest-ranking Holy Knights have become overbearing. Fate's stomach growls, and the Holy Knight hears it. He realizes it was Fate's stomach and asks him to apologize. The Holy Knight can't hear him and tries to kick Fate, but Roxy intervenes and says Fate already apologized. The Holy Knight thinks Roxy's face looks familiar, and the people gathered around believe she looks like Lady Roxy. Greed suggests that Fate should pretend to be Roxy's lover and flirt with her to keep her true identity a secret. Fate says he can't flirt with Roxy. Roxy hears the Holy Knight's comment and decides to pretend to be Fate's lover. She scolds Fate for skipping breakfast and warns him that she won't make breakfast for him again if he doesn't eat it. They act like a couple, fooling everyone around, who now think that she can't be Roxy. Roxy tells the Holy Knight that she will make sure Fate eats properly next time, and they leave. Fate overhears Roxy's thoughts and realizes she's never put her arm around a man before, and she's still feeling excited. He lets go of her arm and apologizes, but Roxy says it's no big deal because she's used to it. Fate thinks that being Lady Roxy's escort is too difficult, and they go to a gem store. Roxy mentions her interest in such things because she's a girl, and asks the shopkeeper if these are also gems. The shopkeeper explains that these are gem ores, and they need to be broken to see if they have gems inside. He mentions they cost 10 copper each. Greed suggests that Fate could use appraisal to find the gems inside in one go. Fate does so and finds a gem inside one of the ores. He thinks that Roxy looks like a normal girl right now. The shopkeeper offers to sell the gem for a silver coin, saying it's a good gift for Fate's girlfriend. Roxy thanks the shopkeeper, and they leave. Roxy then asks Fate if he knows any warriors. Fate mentions Oliver and Manura, and Roxy wonders if he knows someone who's still active. They overhear people talking about a rumor of a stray monster, and one person mentions a warrior who supposedly gives Goblin King's ears to an orphanage. Roxy wants to know more about this story and what else they know about the stray monster. The people suggest that Roxy should talk to the warriors about the stray monster, and they leave. Roxy then asks Fate to take her to a place where the warriors gather. Fate wonders if this is part of the inspection. Roxy explains that it's an inspection for the recently appeared stray monster near the capital. The scene shifts to Fate going to a restaurant he often visits. The master is surprised to see that Fate is still alive. Fate introduces Roxy as Lexi and says she's his senior at his new workplace. The master didn't expect Fate to show up with a girlfriend, which embarrasses both Fate and Roxy. Later, the master mentions a warrior who made a fortune by collecting intact goblin ears. Roxy thinks that a true warrior wouldn't leave the goblin rewards behind, suggesting it's the work of the stray monster. The master explains that it's bad for business because they have to pass through the goblin meadows if they want to do business in the capital. If there's an unknown monster there, nobody will want to go through that area. Fate feels responsible for this situation. An old man named Ad arrives, and Fate knows him. The old man believes the stray monster is likely a lick, and he's heard that the Holy Knights will move to subjugate it. Fate realizes he can't afford to have the Holy Knights as his enemies right now, and the old man asks Roxy why she cares so much about the stray monster. Some warriors enter the restaurant, order drinks and food, and one of them tries to flirt with Roxy. Roxy flicks him away with her finger, surprising the warriors. Roxy reveals herself, apologizes for the deception, and the warriors ask for forgiveness for their rude behavior, offering money to spare their lives. Roxy admits feeling ashamed that the Holy Knights, who are meant to protect the people, are now feared by them. She explains that her father had wished for a world where they could all laugh together with the people, and she shares the same wish. Fate decides that he will stay with Roxy until her wish becomes a reality. Roxy then has some fun with the people in the restaurant. The scene shifts to Greed getting maintenance from a blacksmith. Afterward, Fate thanks Roxy for her help, and she thanks him for helping her find out about the stray monster. Fate wonders why Roxy didn't already know about it. Roxy speculates that the information might have been blocked from reaching her. They hear Hado's voice and go to see what's happening. Roxy notices Hado behaving poorly with a child. Memel explains that they were given custody of this lost child. Roxy is confused about what kind of custody this means. Fate follows Roxy's orders to free the child from Hado, and Roxy decides to take care of the child from here. Roxy asks Raphael why he didn't tell her about the stray monster. Raphael thought Roxy was still thinking about her late father. Roxy reassures him that she's fine now, and Raphael understands. The Varric siblings leave. The child then expresses his dislike for the Holy Knights, and Fate asks if he's lost. The child mentions that he came with his mom, and Fate says they will help him find her. Roxy and Fate search the town for the lost child's mother. Fate recalls a time when he was lost in the city as well, 5 years ago when his father passed away. He remembers how a Holy Knight helped him back then and wonders how she is doing now. They manage to find the kid's mother, and she thanks them for looking out for her child. Fate is relieved that they found her, and suggests they head back before they get scolded. Roxy asks if Fate will stay with her during the scolding, and he agrees. The scene shifts to them being scolded by Haru. Afterward, Fate realizes he needs a way to hunt monsters without being noticed by Lady Roxy. Greed suggests a solution, showing Fate a mask in one of the shops in town. Greed explains that it's a magical item that can conceal someone's identity. Fate thinks it's perfect for his needs and decides to stop by the gem store. The scene then shows Fate giving Roxy a gem ore as a way of thanking her for hiring him. Roxy notices that there's a gem inside the ore and finds it beautiful. She promises to treasure it. and asks Fate what he would like in return. She offers a whetstone or a year's supply of meat, but Fate says he doesn't want anything. Greed advises Fate not to refuse the offer and suggests he ask for the whetstone. Meanwhile, the other Holy Knights are having a meeting to discuss their expedition to Galia. This brings an end to episode 3. The story goes on with an adventurer standing in a field filled with defeated goblins. The adventurer believes that Fate has once more outsmarted them, and they're curious about when the Holy Knights will take action. Suddenly, the adventurer spots Fate, who is now known as Corpse the Lick. Startled, they quickly flee, leaving Fate to think about his new name, Corpse. On the other hand, Greed appreciates the name. Greed wonders if he is not full yet. Fate mentions that he wants to boost his stats as much as possible before the Holy Knights come after him. The story moves to Fate working in Roxy's garden, showing his weariness from his double life. Roxy approaches Fate and tells him about a secret mission. Fate wonders if it's another inspection. They are now in a carriage heading to the land owned by the Hart family. Fate thinks this secret mission might be about harvesting grapes. However, Roxy just wanted Fate to see their grapes up close. They arrive at Roxy's farmhouse, where Roxy's mother, Aisha Hart, warmly welcomes them. Roxy tells her mother she didn't have to greet her, but Aisha insists. When she asks who Fate is, Roxy introduces him as a servant she hired and brings him forward for an introduction. Fate politely greets Aisha, introducing himself. Aisha asks Fate if he likes her daughter, and Roxy is puzzled by the question. Aisha clarifies she's merely curious about his opinion of Roxy as his employer. Roxy thinks her mother should have worded it differently. Fate responds by expressing his deep care for Lady Roxy, and how he would serve her for the rest of his life if allowed. Roxy is embarrassed and hastily leaves, claiming she needs to rest. Aisha thinks that Roxy hasn't changed and still runs away when she feels uncomfortable. She recalls how Roxy used to be quite a crybaby when she was little. Fate is surprised, as Roxy's behavior in the capital didn't give away her crybaby past. Aisha shares her concern that Roxy might be pushing herself too hard, especially after her father's death. Fate reassures Aisha that Roxy is an excellent Holy Knight, and that the people have great faith in her. The scene shifts to Roxy in her room, looking at a picture that reminds her of training with her father. In her memory, her father is helping her with her posture, and she expresses her desire to become a Holy Knight who can share laughter with the people, just like her father. Back in the present, Roxy feels like she hasn't fulfilled her promise. The story then moves to Fate and the workers harvesting grapes. A worker offers Fate some juice to help with his fatigue, and Fate finds it delicious. The worker explains that the lords have been cultivating this land for generations, and everyone in the property takes pride in creating this unique flavor. Fate wonders if this includes Sir Mason, and the worker sadly informs him that Sir Mason passed away in Galia. Fate realizes this must be tough for Lady Roxy. The worker also mentions they weren't sure if Roxy would come this year, and they are grateful that she did. Fate wonders if Roxy helps with the harvest every year, and the worker confirms that she does, as well as hunting monsters that come for food during the harvest, particularly kobolds from the valleys in the north. Fate's stomach growls, and Greed teases him about his gluttony skill craving different souls. Fate finishes harvesting for the day, and Roxy asks him to go ahead as she has more work to do. Fate notices a girl carrying a large axe on his way, and her eyes look similar to his, making him curious. He tries to use his appraisal skill but can't get any information. The girl realizes she's early for something and mentions that she came for kobolds, but she's fine with Fate taking them. She leaves, and Fate asks Greed who she was, but Greed has no information. Roxy arrives with some grapes and shares them with Fate. He realizes she went to get some for him. Roxy explains that the passing girl was a Galan, and Fate recalls that Galia was destroyed. Roxy tells him that 4,000 years ago, Galia was a powerful nation, but it collapsed due to a surge of monsters, resulting in the death of most of its people. She mentions that she's never seen such a pure Galan before and heads back with Fate. He expresses concern about the monster hunt, and Roxy assures him that she won't be alone. The workers and warriors will accompany her. The next day, the workers find their grapes destroyed by monsters. Roxy, Fate, and some warriors spy on the monsters responsible, which are kobolds. They notice something different among the kobolds, and the warriors are baffled. Greed mentions that he's nearly starving just looking at this scene. Fate checks the monster stats, realizing it's a level 50 creature named the Bringer of Lamentation. Greed explains that it's a crowned beast born from accumulated aggression over time. The workers and warriors discuss their inability to face this creature, but Roxy reassures them by stating she will slay it. Greed doubts that Roxy can handle it alone, and the warriors request a day to prepare for the hunt. Roxy agrees. Greed asks Fate what they will do, and Fate acknowledges that a level 50 monster is beyond his current skill level. Still, he can't ignore the people and lands of the Heart family, and he won't let Roxy die. Fate tells Greed that they must face this challenge. The scene then shifts to Fate at the place where they saw the kobolds, and Greed mentions that the crown monster is surrounded by kobold warriors, and others are probably all kobold juniors. Greed wonders if Fate has a plan, and Fate says he'll fight like a glutton. Fate transforms Greed into a bow and starts shooting the kobolds from a distance. He then engages in close combat with his sword, noticing his stats are increasing but realizing it's not enough. Fate attempts to shoot the crown monster with his bow, but the monster stops the arrows with his bare hands. Fate decides to fight the monster up close. During the battle, the crown monster uses a dangerous skill called Ruinous Strike, which can shatter bones and crush organs. Fate fails to dodge the attack, and it takes him out temporarily. A kobold pretends to attack Fate, but he was only pretending to be unconscious. The crown monster attempts the same attack on Fate, but this time, Fate manages to dodge and slays another kobold. Greed suggests that Fate should now be able to use his first level hidden art, but he needs to allocate 10% of Fate's stats to unlock it. Fate agrees, and Greed transforms into some kind of crossbow. Fate uses it to attack the crown monster, eventually taking it down. Fate's eyes turn red, and he wonders what's happening. Greed explains that Fate is overwhelmed because he devoured a soul of higher quality for the first time. He advises Fate to hold it in because not doing so will be even worse than a state of starvation. The next day, Roxy and the warriors discover the kobolds' corpses. They notice wounds caused by swords and magic arrows, and Roxy wonders who could have done this. Galleons are rumored to be even more powerful than holy knights, so she wonders if it was her. Regardless, they can rest easy for now. Aisha then approaches Fate and asks for a favor to stay by her daughter's side and support her. Fate hesitates, feeling unworthy due to his hidden secret, the gluttony skill. Aisha explains that she's not asking for prestige, authority, or strength like a holy knight. It's Fate's heart that she values. She shares her own experience, being of common birth with no notable skills, yet she could support her husband. Aisha, aware of her limited time, wants Fate to take care of Roxy. She acknowledges that Fate can't answer right away, and asks him to consider it. As Fate and Roxy leave the farmhouse, Fate questions his worthiness while carrying the secret of the gluttony skill. He encounters some goblins on the way back to town but realizes they don't satisfy his hunger anymore. Greed warns him that goblins won't suffice, and time is running out. Fate needs to decide his next steps. Fate is at a restaurant, pondering if he has the right to stand beside Roxy. He overhears that Hado is joining the hunt for corpse and speculates that it's an easy way for Hado to gain glory. Fate thinks they should send Hado to the Galia expedition, but he's surprised to learn that another expedition to Galia is imminent. Fate worries about the worst-case scenario and Roxy's involvement in the expedition. She asks her father to watch over, and Fate implores her not to go, but she's already decided. Fate suspects the Velaric and other holy knights are involved, viewing the Heart family as an obstacle. Meanwhile, the Velaric supporters celebrate getting rid of Roxy. We learn that Raphael and Memel are heading to Tenburn for Raphael's research, and Hado urges Raphael to share details about his research. Raphael advises Hado to deal with the Lick first. The scene then shifts to Hado facing off against the corpse warrior. This brings an end to our episode. If you enjoyed it, then don't forget to subscribe our channel for more anime recap. The story goes on as Hado finally comes face to face with Corpse, who has a strange glowing red eye. Hado eagerly orders his men to attack first, but Corpse is way stronger than them now. They seem so slow to Corpse that they look like they're not moving at all. Corpse easily defeats Hado's men, and Hado can only stand there in shock, unable to do anything. Corpse then turns his anger toward the other warriors, and the rest of Hado's group runs away in fear. Hado, although clearly terrified, tries to act brave. He insists that he won't let Corpse make a fool out of him and calls Corpse a monster. Corpse decides to remove his mask, revealing his true identity as Fate. This leaves Hado stunned. He can't believe someone he thought of as worthless could be so incredibly powerful. Fate doesn't bother to explain anything, and Hado does his best to stay calm, but his entire body is trembling with fear. Hado tries to gather himself, reminding Fate that he's the second son of the Velaric family, the renowned holy knight Hado Velaric. Unfortunately for Hado, Fate is not the person he used to bully. Fate challenges Hado to show his holy knight powers, which Hado takes immense pride in. Fate checks Hado's stats and explains that Hado possesses the Holy Sword technique, a special skill necessary for becoming a holy knight. Fate wonders how someone like Hado ended up with this skill, and asks Greed if he can shatter a holy sword. Greed confidently claims that he's much better than Hado, and tells Fate to swing without holding back. Surprisingly, Hado starts feeling confident again and calls Fate foolish for getting close to his sword's range. He unleashes a massive attack, only to be stunned when Fate suddenly appears behind him. Hado desperately tries to attack Fate, but Fate effortlessly slices his sword in half and catches the broken piece. Hado can't believe his holy sword was destroyed so easily, and Fate instructs him to retrieve the other piece. Fate tells Hado to pick up his sword from the ground, leaving Hado speechless. Fate reminds Hado that he's a holy knight and shouldn't be so eager to run away. Hado, overwhelmed with fear, stumbles and falls. Fate calls him pathetic and forces him to stand. Fate intends to teach Hado a lesson, recalling the time when Hado told him that defiant dogs need strict discipline. Hado, horrified, knows what's coming and pleads for Fate to stop, but Fate ignores his pleas and smashes Hado's face into a mountain. He thrashes Hado through the forest, leaving him almost unrecognizable. Hado desperately begs for mercy, which surprises Fate, as Hado typically treats others like insects. To make matters worse, Fate's beloved Roxy is now in danger due to individuals like Hado, who Fate sees as filth. Hado makes one last desperate attempt to plead for Fate to stop, but at this point, Fate is seething with anger. He sends Hado flying high into the air. Fate checks his stats again and asks Greed to transform into a big bow, unleashing a powerful attack that leaves Hado without his limbs. Hado wonders why Fate would choose to spare his life and now pleads for Fate to just end it all. Fate, however, has questions for Hado, and Hado knows that Fate wants to know about Roxy. He reveals that Roxy volunteered to go on the expedition to Galia. She believed that if her life could save even one citizen of the kingdom, it would be worth it. Hado thought it over and decided to beg for mercy, promising to get Roxy's expedition cancelled. He pleads with Fate not to do something foolish. Fate gets ready to end Hado's life, and Hado warns him that seeking revenge for Roxy's sake would be a grave mistake. Fate tells Hado to be quiet and declares that he's doing this for himself. He thrusts his blade through Hado's chest, claiming it as his revenge. With Hado now dead, Fate's Gluttony skill activates, and he acquires the Holy Sword Technique skill. Greed points out that this technically makes Fate a holy knight now. However, Fate knows that the capital would never accept him as one, and he angrily states that he wouldn't want to be one anyway. Greed explains that Fate can access his second level, and Fate accepts, even though the idea of having Hado's stats inside him disgusts him. Greed transforms once again and reveals that he can now become a great scythe. It's not just for looks, the blade is cursed, allowing it to cut through anything. While this is impressive, Fate wishes the scythe could cut short Roxy's journey to Galia. The scene changes, and we see Roxy getting ready for her expedition. She puts the gem that Fate gave her around her neck. Fate can't do anything to stop her from leaving, and he can only watch along with everyone else. Roxy tries to comfort everyone, telling them not to be too sad and assuring them that 3 years will pass quickly. She then makes her way to Fate, where he wants to express his feelings to her. However, he stops himself, reminding himself that he's a monster and not good for her. Roxy believes they will see each other again and they bid their farewells. Afterwards, Haru gives Fate the recommendation letter that Roxy left for him. As long as Fate is employed at a lord's manor, the Valerics won't be able to harm him. Fate realizes that Roxy worried about him until the very end. However, he decides to reject the letter. Haru is shocked, so Fate explains that he's going to make his way as a warrior from now on. That night, Fate tells Greed that if he can't stop Lady Roxy from going to Galia, he will at least support her. Fate begins his journey to Galia, and we see a girl watching him, mentioning that things are shaping up nicely. Sometime later, Roxy gives a speech to all the troops joining the expedition. She declares that they all need to do their best to destroy the divine dragon that has awakened after a millennium of silence. After the speech, Roxy is pleased to see that a girl named Mia and a guy named Mugen will be joining as well. Maria points out that Mugen is just another reckless oddball looking for a chance to test his strength against the dragon. Mugen can't deny it, and Roxy calms Maria down, which excites Maria, who is a die-hard fan of Roxy. Mugen explains that he volunteered because of Roxy's father, as he used to work for him and just wants to avenge him. Roxy wonders if Mugen's family is against him going to Galia, but he explains that his daughter, named Rain, couldn't care less and just wanted him to bring back some Galia relics. The two start arguing again, and Roxy has a good laugh as she thinks that the trip might work out fun. The scene changes, and we discover that Mugen's daughter, Rain, is a researcher. She's in a lab filled with goblin body parts. She's told that some of these parts come from attacks by the lake called corpse. They point out that the arrow wounds on the goblin parts are far from normal. Rain investigates and finds that these wounds are from the magic arrows of the Black Sword, one of the weapons of mortal sin. These weapons are made of a material that can manipulate magic power at a high level. Not much is known about these weapons, but Rain is certain that if they can control magic power, they could expand the range of skills a wielder could use, making them extremely dangerous. She's eager to see one of these weapons. The scene changes again, and we find Fate arriving at Tetra, a hub for shipping, on his way to the royal capital, a city of merchants where the best goods from the south are gathered. Greed is surprised to hear that Fate has been there before. Fate explains that he passed through, but he remembers an incident where some kids threw stones at him while he was drawing water from a well. Fate is then informed that the carriage won't be leaving for Galia until the next day because monsters are very active at night. As he leaves, Greed makes another comment about Roxy, and Fate tells him to be quiet, accidentally directing his frustration at the carriage driver. Fate's stomach starts to growl, and he decides to go eat some meat. We see a guy asking a group of warriors for their help. The money he's offering isn't enough, so these warriors start bullying the poor guy. Just then, Fate arrives and easily scares them away. Fate greets his old friend, Set. We are then taken into Fate's past, revealing that he used to live in this village. His constant stomach growling would often get him into trouble, and he was frequently beaten up. He had a close relationship with his father, who was a skilled warrior. Fate used to make him medicine as he always got injured. However, Fate's father, Dean, eventually passed away. The other villagers acknowledged Dean's skill, called the spear technique, and the village chief kept him around. Unfortunately, Fate's skill was considered useless, and nobody was willing to take care of him. So, the village chief decided to cast him out of the village, calling him worthless garbage. In the present, Set kneels in front of Fate, asking for his help to save the village. Fate, unmoved by Set's tears, explains that Set is the son of the same village chief who had exiled him. Greed encourages Fate to assist, mainly because his gluttony skill needs to be satisfied, and the monsters attacking Set's village present an ideal opportunity. Fate agrees to help, reflecting on his lingering resentment toward the people. Despite his feelings, he still holds on to memories of his father from that place. They arrive at the village, but the village chief is disappointed to see that his son has brought back the weakling he had exiled. Set attempts to vouch for Fate's strength after witnessing him easily defeat the warriors, but the chief refuses to listen. He decides that they will have to find warriors the next day. The chief's lackeys point out that screams have been heard from a nearby forest, and the monsters are drawing near. Time is running out, so the chief decides to use Fate as a sacrifice to buy them some time. Fate has had enough of the chief's insults, but Set implores him to stay calm. At Set's house, Fate learns that Set's wife was killed by the monsters. Set regrets growing up believing that his father was always right, and explains that he only began to turn his life around when his daughter was born. Set further reveals that the monsters first appeared about a month ago. Witnesses claim that there is more than one, and they can apparently fly. These monsters are unlike any the village has had to deal with before, prompting the decision to hire warriors. Fate's stomach loudly growls, and Set goes to get him some food. Fate asks Greed if he has any idea about the creatures they're dealing with, and Greed assumes that they are likely gargoyles. These creatures are somewhat clever, so they start with probing attacks to see how humans react. When the time is right, the whole group attacks in a swarm. Set's daughter becomes curious and asks Fate whom he is talking to, but Fate says he was just talking to himself. She then offers Fate a piece of candy to settle his stomach. They decide to play for a bit, and the girl and Fate try arm wrestling. Fate lets the girl win to make her happy. Set brings him some bread, and Fate starts eating the food Set brought him. He's shocked when he suddenly feels tired and faints. Set is surprised too because there was nothing wrong with the food. The little girl explains that she gave Fate some candy that her grandpa gave her. Set begins to realize that his father was very serious about sacrificing Fate. Greed uses all this information to deduce that the candy was poison. He tries to wake Fate up, but there's no time for that because he hears screams nearby and discovers that the monsters have reached the village. This brings an end to our episode. If you enjoyed it, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more anime recaps.